So what we're getting ready to look at next is going to be embryo flushing and transferring. Generally, the overall process is almost identical to artificial insemination as far as preparation. It's just a little bit more invasive with this, as you're actually going to be grabbing the uterine horns and pulling them out so that you can manipulate and flush out the embryos from the uterine horns. And then for the transfer, you'll actually be putting the good embryos into the uterine horns. Now, one of the things I want to kind of talk about before we get into that is typically your selection for your ewes that you're going to use for embryo flushing is they are your top genetics, just like you do and select for your sires that you're going to use for artificial insemination. You want the ewe that you want to keep her genetics around. So you'll go in through the synchronization process, and you'll basically cause that ewe or doe that you've selected to superovulate. So instead of releasing a few eggs, they may release up to 10, 20 or more eggs at once. And then you'll go in with the artificial insemination process to actually fertilize those eggs. And then after a few days, after you've artificially inseminated them, you'll go back in, and at this point, you're going to be flushing out those fertilized eggs. So you should have good, viable embryos. You'll take those embryos, you'll take them over to the microscope, look at them, make sure they're good and viable. And those embryos will then be implanted into what is known as a recipient doe or ewe. And these are generally ewes and does that you've selected out of your herd that have proven through natural breeding that they're good mothers. In other words, they are the ones that can carry twins, have good milk, they've got good average daily gains on the young, and they show good mothering instincts. They take care of their young. And you want to use these for the recipients for those embryos, because you know that they're going to take care of those offspring once they're born. The recipient is kind of prepped like you're doing artificial insemination, so that it preps the uterine horns to accept the embryo when you actually implant it in them. So I'm kind of looking here at one of my ewes. I wouldn't use her for a donor, but she's a good mother. Out of the 2 times she's given lambs so far, she's had twins at each of the births. She takes good care of them. She has plenty of milk to raise them. And so if I was going to actually do embryo flushing and then transferring, I'd probably use her as a recipient ewe just because of her mothering instincts. I have another ewe down here, kind of the same thing. Wouldn't use her for a donor for the embryos, but she'd make a great recipient. She's hiding over here on me. But she'd make a good recipient. She, again, is one that typically has twins under natural breeding conditions. And she raises up nice lambs with a good average daily gains, has plenty of milk, and is very good at taking care of her lambs. So, wouldn't use her for a donor, but I would use her for a recipient. And then, with the rest of my flock right now, I've got quite a few young ewes, because I bought at 10 months old, or roughly around there. And so most of them are first-time mothers. I don't know what their mothering ability is, and first-timers can be hit or miss, not meaning that they're not going to develop into good moms, just sometimes that first time doesn't really kick in very well. So I'd wait until after they've lambed second time under natural breeding conditions to evaluate them for the potential to be a recipient. That way you know that their mothering instincts have kicked in. You kind of know how they do as far as milk production and everything else. So one of the things we'll talk about a little bit here before we actually get into some of the videos of the actual embryo flushing and transfer is talk a little bit about the numbers you can look at and what you kind of expect with this. So most donors will average between 5 to 12 good embryos per flush. The donors can be reflushed about every 2 months. And then as you go through and you're doing the flushes, you'll take a look at your embryos. The good embryos should become pregnancies about 60 to 80% of the time. You can freeze embryos, and that allows for storing of your own embryos, or you can sell the embryos and implant them at any time. The freezing of the embryos does degrade them a little bit, so you definitely got to make sure you've got good embryos to start with for the ones that you choose to freeze. Overall, embryo transfer is a useful tool, and what it allows you to do is to achieve more progeny from one ewe doe or a group than is normally possible in the usual lifetime of that female. Typically, you're going to want to do this with your superior ewes and does because you're wanting to continue their genetics just like you would for a sire that you select to do collect semen and do artificial insemination with. Basically, what will end up happening is a series of hormone injections are given to the donor females, which will cause them to release multiple ova or eggs at a controlled time. Fertilization of these multiple eggs is achieved by standard laparoscopic insemination and or potentially with natural service. Most of the time, most people, if they're going to do the embryo transfers, embryo flushing and transfer, typically are going to do it through artificial insemination rather than natural service, just because you have a better showing with them, typically. Generally 6 days after the eggs have been fertilized, they will be flushed from the uterus of the donor. They're microscopically examined, as I mentioned above, graded, and then transferred as singles or twins to the uterine horns of the synchronized recipient females. So if you're thinking about doing this, the question will probably come up of, what user does are suitable as donors. Again, any donor that has a healthy reproductive tract and achieved puberty is a candidate for embryo transfer. You can go with your young animals even as young as 8 months. It's just typically like to wait for them to have a couple of cycles, just so that their body reacts better to the hormones when they're given the hormone treatment to superovulate. One of the kind of interesting, cool things with embryo flushing and when you're doing that superovulation is that if a ewe or doe releases a large amount of embryos on a flushing, typically they will always do it that way. So it's kind of nice in your record keep track of who your high ovulators are and who your low ovulators are. And then, if it's good genetics, obviously you're going to want to keep the genetics, but it may be something to think about. Is it really worth doing the protocols with the female if you're not getting a lot of eggs back out of them? Generally, your embryos that can be recovered per flush will be anywhere from 0 up to potentially 30. Again, your average of 5 to 12, that's taken across however many you have, and that becomes the average. So you may have a few that are, only 1 or 2. Then you may have some that are the super producers, you get 25 to 30. You may run into the issue where some donors don't give viable embryos, and there's a couple of reasons that can happen on this. They may not have had the response to their hormone treatment. The donor may have no or very small number of ova released. Fertilization of the released ova failed, which can happen if you didn't get the timing down right. Semen quality needs to be high in order to achieve fertilization. And even with that, sometimes fertilization does not occur. The other thing you may see is that fertilization occurred, but the embryos start to die after a few divisions. And these are referred to typically as degenerate embryos and are not transferred to recipients. It does happen. Like I said, it may be that particular female goes through her cycling faster than some of the others, and so these eggs degenerate. The other thing you may be trying to figure out is how many pregnancies will result from good embryos. And typically, the answer on that is 60 to 80% of the good embryos should result in pregnancies. There are some things that, there's outside factors that can affect it. But the management of that ewe or doe and their fertility is really the key to how many of those result in pregnancies. Higher or lower results can occur, and according to the level of management that the recipient was under. And generally what happens is you're going through and you're going through your recipients, each one is laparoscopically inspected to make sure that the uterine and ovary health is good. If it's not, then they will not receive embryos. So one of the things on embryo freezing, it can be done for the sale of the embryos or for storage for implantation at a later time. Maybe you had a whole batch that were like in the super producing group, and so you got 20 to 25 eggs per, and you didn't have enough recipients prepped. You can freeze them and store them and get another group prepped to receive those embryos. Generally, the embryos are stored in the liquid nitrogen just like semen is. And only your good quality embryos will survive the freezing and thawing. All embryos are damaged to some degree by the freezing. So where you might have normally had 60-80% pregnancy result from good embryos, you may see that you're at 5 to 10% lower on that conception rate. Still not a bad thing. Just you'll have a little bit lower for frozen versus fresh embryos.